Coming at you from the Shadow Shine Mountain out here, where we're expecting heavy snow next week. Really not looking forward to that one, actually. I'm Will Stroh, and joining me as always, holding down the Q&A room, the Mick Jagger to my Keith Richards, and he's got the moves to prove it. We got Adelpho Campos out there. Today, we'll be discussing how you paid money for your Qumulo cluster, and now you want to keep it up tip-top shape there. I'm going to preface this by saying that a lot of what we're going to cover today we did cover in the summer webinar rundowns. We are not going to cover things that keep your data healthy, such as replication to a DR site or using fluid IPs instead of static ones, things like that. If that's of interest to you, please either email deargrumpquad@qumulo.com. That'll actually get to me. And we can get a refresher course going, or you can check our archives. I want to say it was last summer, not this summer, but the one prior, 2024, I guess, that we covered replication and things along that nature, but it might be time for a refresher anyhow. So, if that's something you'd like, or if you have ideas for other webinars, by all means, please, again, feel free to email that email address, deargrumpquat@qumulo.com, and we'll get something going out there. So, with that being said, let's get this bad boy going here. So, first and foremost, when you maintain your healthy Qumulo cluster, are there any banners on the screen? If not, you're in good shape. That's really the end of the webinar. So, come back on November 6th. We'll be talking cluster config DR, and then we'll take. I'm being told that's not the end of the webinar. Sorry about that. So we'll continue on, I guess. All right. So, places to check for alerts out there. One is the web UI. Certainly, if you do have banners out there, that is a spooky, scary sounding thing, much like little skeletons, but they're really sometimes not. Let's take a look at what we got. So these guys will be across the top of your UI. Let me pull up a cluster real quick. I thought I had everything ready here and just shy of getting a cluster ready. So let's see if we can randomly guess an IP address of one. This looks like it may have worked. So those banners that do go across the top of your screen there, those are going to be things that you should probably take a look at. And I say probably because there's some that you do need to worry about and some you don't. They will be listed right above the overview on your UI. I don't have a cluster that's coming up right now, unfortunately. I did a poor job of guessing at that one. But you will see things like drives missing, nodes offline. Now, you will see banners up there for other things too. You'll see them for new nodes, if it finds something new. If you have replication issues, if you need to authorize replication on a target site, any of that stuff, those will all be banners up there. Now, again, are these of concern? Maybe, maybe not. If you're expecting new nodes to add, then great. But if you're not expecting new nodes to add, then you might want to question why you should have that showing up there. But by and large, the two you really want to be concerned about are going to be your nodes offline, your drives failed, and or missing out there. Now, I know we've seen some of you guys have seen some outreaches come from the CS team regarding, getting some upgrades in for some drive controller issues where drives may go missing out there. You'd see those up there, but by and large, as long as you're upgrading in a timely manner, it shouldn't be an issue. Now, additionally, there are some things that we can. Well, let me back up here. So the things that show up in the cluster UI, anything in that UI is just an API call. So let's do some inside baseball here for a second. Let's pause this. We'll bring this cluster over here. Hopefully that's showing up there. And let's just do a QQ version, right? Straight, simple, easy, cool. 764. Now, the thing you can do actually is that you can throw, and you don't have to be any special. You can do this out of sudo shell or QSH, it doesn't matter. But you can throw a -- debug in front of that thing and kick off a version. And this will actually tell you what API call I'm actually running to pull that up there. So likewise, if you want to see, let's say cluster slots, that one sounds like a good one. -- debug cluster slots. We're going to pipe this through more just so we can scroll back. So we don't have to scroll back too much, I guess. Okay, so there was version. So where's my cluster slots going here? Here we go. So it runs that API call. So the reason we throw this out here is anything in that UI is really just pulling API calls. So, there's nothing fanciful or magical about that. Now, the things that we don't have API calls for are going to be hardware related things. And those will get, well, I guess drives are hardware related, but certain things like CPU temps, network interfaces, things along that nature, those do get covered in open metrics though. So if you go over to your Nexus account, let me pull this guy over here, and you will see who is this? Eng Large. I don't know who he is, but he's apparently a large cluster. In your Nexus account, you will see these guys here, where it shows hardware health, nodes, drives, network interfaces. If this was an on-prem one, you'd see one here also for CPU information. This is a really good place just to get a quick overview of whether or not things are in good shape. One of the most common asked questions from customers is, does everything look good? And this is oftentimes sent over after they do a disk swap, or they do a chassis swap and everything comes back online. And the dirty little secret there is, if you're not seeing a banner for it, it looks good. That's the reality of it, right? Because those banners are going to be calling against that API call and looking for those things out there. So I guess one, this is a plea for, you don't need us to check to make sure your drives are okay, unless there's reason to believe they aren't. For example, if you did have a let's say an HPE box where the drives are showing up, but they're not showing up on the Qumulo side, okay, that's reason to go ahead and reach out there. But if you replace a drive and it starts reprotecting, no need to reach out to us. That means it's good. You're in good shape. But again, you can always come out here and take a look at Nexus and see what it shows out here. Are all my drives there? Yes, cool, great. Moving on with life there. So pop back over there. It's going going again. As I said, your additional alerts via Nexus, those are coming from open API calls. You can go through the motions of getting Qumulo alerts installed out there. My understanding is at some point, Nexus is basically going to be doing the same thing as Qumulo alerts. And I know for a lot of folks, it's Qumulo alerts itself. It's running in a Dockerized container out there on some other Linux box. That is a hurdle for some people, and I understand that. So if that's something you're interested in, but not interested in enough to actually go through the setup of everything out there, more and more open API calls are getting fed into Nexus, so that can become your go-to at that point. All right, let's take a look here where we're going next. So that's through the web UI side of things. As we mentioned, everything in the web UI is really just an API call. So anything you run from the CLI, that QQ that's in the front side of that, all that is simply a wrapper for an API call. So again, if we want to see drives that are missing, for example, let's just bring this guy over here. So again, this cluster slots, in this case, we're checking for dead and empty. What that's coming down to is this state variable here. So cluster slots is going to feed a big old JSON output to the screen. And this will go through, because it's a QQ command, it's going to go through every node on the cluster. So you're going to get spammed with a lot of stuff on your screen. And certainly for those of you, I'm seeing a couple of you on the call here that have very large clusters in the tune of, 80, 90, 100 nodes. Those will just scroll your screen away. there's really no nice way to put that. So if you're competent with JQ, great, you can certainly parse this out. If you're old school Unix like myself and not really competent with JQ, egrep can be your friend here real quick. The state field here is going to show healthy, dead, or empty, one of those three. And there are some small differences between them. I mean, obviously, Healthy is healthy. Great. That means, the system sees the drive. We are actively using that drive out there. Everything's great. Dead and empty is where it becomes more of a fine line. So dead is the system sees a drive, but we are unable to talk to it. Now that could be for various reasons out there. In some older releases where we keep I guess keeping in the newer release as well. But we are going to have a tracker of failed disks. So you kind of think of it as a failed disk registry, if you will. And in those cases, we may mark that serial number out there so that the system references that and says, oh, okay, this serial number, in this case, do we got a serial number here? Yeah. Alpha Echo 3, that one is in my failed drives. So we're going to mark this as dead. The system knows it's there, but we're not going to use it. Now, where this can run into confusion is people will say, well, my ILO shows it's just fine. And that's absolutely acceptable. And I expect we'll see this more often in the run anywhere environment as we move forward, where the underlying hardware is going to have different thresholds than what the Qumulo has. On the Qumulo side, if we see 3 drive errors in the span of 14 days, we will mark that drive as not healthy, so dead in that case. Now, those could be 3 read errors, 3 write errors, combination of the two. But really, if we see 3 of them in a 14-day period, we're sending it away. And we're doing that, and it is a very aggressive find, if you will. But we do it for data assurance at that point, right? We want to make sure that we get to the issue before it becomes a problem. Now, I'm going to pick on HPE here just because they're the big one in the room. HPE does not have that same threshold, so they'll still show a drive as good, and that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable. But what we will want to do at that point is go ahead and get that drive replaced, regardless of what the ILO shows, just to ensure that from the Qumulo side, we're in good shape. Now, there are situations where we may fail a drive and we know it's not actually failed. There could be a firmware issue out there where, aggressively tries to write to something and it's not keeping track of bad sectors, for instance, or what have you, bad bits on the disk. And in those cases, we can certainly go in there and we can increase that threshold for that disk or for multiple disks if that may be the case. But by and large, just know that 3 failures is really going to be 3 failures in 14 days is really going to be your key there to take a look after. Now, if it is showing up as empty, we said that there's a fine line between dead and empty there. Empty may also be dead, but empty is also saying, okay, we're not registering this drive at this point. So for all of you old school folks out there who've ever swapped PCB boards on hard drives, you used to be able to bring hard drives back to life just by undoing those 5 little screws on the back, swapping a new PCB on there, and call it a day. It doesn't work that way anymore. So now there's more information stored on there for the drive itself. But when something shows up as empty at that point, then it becomes a question of, is it a singular drive that's showing up as empty, or is it multiples out there? Because the difference is going to be, am I dealing with a drive issue? Am I dealing with a bay issue? Or am I possibly dealing with, Bigfoot delivered this cluster to my data center, and I'm dealing with a cabling issue at that point. I got something dangling out there that's should be plugged in. So there's a couple different ways that can be approached at that point. And at the end of the day, it is definitely going to require someone physically hands-on taking a look at things. But that is something where there are multiple reasons to it. So if you are experiencing one of those or have experienced it in the past, apologies out there to you if it was not a straightforward answer, but it's not a straightforward problem at that point either. All right, I think we've run that one into the ground. So let's take a look at some of these other ones here. If we take a look at protection status get, So this is going to tell you a whole bunch of information that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you outside of these two lines here at the bottom. These are going to tell you how many, exactly what it says on the screen here, how many remaining drive failures I have and how many node failures I can withstand. Now, in this case, this guy he has an erasure coding of 8.6. You can tell that from right here, which gives you the 2 and 1. It's also the same as if you had a 6.4 encoding out there. We're just making wider stripes at this point. So the thing to keep in mind here is, let's say I have a drive failure. Oh no, this number here is going to drop to 1. Now, it's not required for me to insert another, to pull that failed drive out, put a spare in place to get that back up to 2. That's absolutely not required. We will rebuild the data onto, basically you're updating pointers at that point, but rebuilding the data on with the other drives that are in the system. Now we're only rebuilding the actual used data there. So that's something key to keep in mind. If you have, if I go back in my memory, when 1 terabyte drives came out, showing my age here now, we had those at another vendor, and they would when a drive failed, it would go off and reprotect the entire drive itself from block 0 to block whatever at the tail end of that drive. And so I mentioned 1 terabyte drives because it would take 10 hours to recover a 1 terabyte drive at that point. And during that 10-hour period, you're definitely at risk of losing another drive and being up a certain creek. Now, in our case, we're only reprotecting the actual used data out there. We don't care about any of the other space out there. The empty space doesn't bother us. Therefore, we can recover that fairly quickly, all things considered. Now, all we have to do is reprotect against that data that is used out there. And then at that point, this number goes back up to 2. Now, if you take a look up here, we see max drive spares 6, right? Basically, we have sparing space for 6 drive failures across the system. So I can lose 1 drive, reprotect against it, fine. This goes back up to 2. This max drive spares would go down to 5 at that point. Lose another one, my main drive failures goes down to 1. We reprotect against it, comes back to 2. Max drive spares down to 4 at this point. There is nothing that says you cannot run in that sort of situation for a long time. We have seen customers do it. It's always entertaining when you have a customer who, takes a long vacation at the start of summer, and they just so happens to coincide with a drive failure, and they come back at the end of summer and they're like, well, everything looks good, but I can't upgrade because it's saying I need all drives here. And 3 months prior, they had a drive failure out there. Perfectly fine, acceptable. It works. Now, it will keep them from being able to upgrade, obviously. But as far as the system running, not a problem with that. Not a problem with that. Now, with my remaining node failures, that's where things get a little more dicey. Because obviously you have more than 2 drives in a node, hopefully. So in those cases, let's just say we have 10 drives in a node, just to make the math easy. So at this point, if I have a node go offline, now I'm in a situation where I'm kind of outside of my remaining drive failure realm. For me, because that's only 2 there. We will still reprotect things to keep operational. However, all my writes, in the case of a hybrid system where you have spinning disks fronted with SSDs, all of my writes are only going to go to my SSDs at that point because I can guarantee where those are at. And I don't need to make a stripe of everything across the system there. For those of you with all flash, it's a little bit different. You'll still be in operational state. But in cases with hybrid, you do have a runway at that point. And typically, we're not talking hours. Typically, you are probably talking days, but there is a runway, and it's really dependent upon how much or how many, if you will, writes are coming into the system. So this morning we were troubleshooting, myself and a colleague, we were troubleshooting a customer in France, and they had a down node, but it's on a DR site. So yeah, okay, it's not as earth shattering as having to be in their actual production, but with that node down, they do have a limited runway at that point. So because this is the DR site, we need to look into doing things like canceling any replications that may be going there, or at least getting a feel for how those writes are affecting the rest of the SSD space out there. Once that SSD space is used up, the cluster will go read only because there's nowhere to write. Now that you're not losing data at that point, you're just read only. You can still pull things off there if you really want to. But what you can't do is do any writes to it. So from that perspective, you can use your own judgment as to whether or not that is going to be a career limiting move or if it's something that's easily worked around. But with the node failures, it is something to keep in mind. Now, having said that, how often do nodes fail? Nah. People unfortunately don't call support when things are working fine. So I can't rightfully say. With that said, I will say it is rarer than having a dry fail, for instance. Now, if you are in a situation, let's say you're a hospital down in a valley and it's snow season and snow and ice is coming in and you're not going to be able to get a delivery truck in there. In those situations, we have worked with those customers where we will go ahead and say, you know what, let's work with you to get a hot chassis on site. It's if this hospital goes down, that is a life and death situation at that point. That becomes a concern, and let's see if we can alleviate that concern. So there are ways around it, and it's not that complicated, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, that being said, does that mean every customer should have a hot chassis on site? Absolutely not. Most times, the chassis itself, if it's going to fail, it'll fail during install, is really where we'd see it. Because again, you have Bigfoot chucking these things around in the woods. Things will get loosened up and move on with life. So by and large, I wouldn't really fret that one too much. It's just a good thing to know at that point. Alrighty. Now, when we talked about network over the summer, I think it was back in June, we looked at this ETH tool command out here. So let's take a look at this real quick, and we're just going to feed an interface. I think ETH1 exists. ETH1 exists, yay! So this is just a straight up Linux ETH tool command. There's nothing magical here, but this will tell you real quick if you got link detected or not. Now, if you are expecting to have two ports on your system, let's say ETH0 and ETH1, and one of these shows up as link detected no, other things you're going to see is speed's not going to have anything out there. Port won't say fiber most likely. Things like that. At that point, you really need to check your physical connections. And so one thing I would say is it's strange how often this happens, but if I had a nickel for every time that a port goes bad and customers don't really notice it until much later, I would be a rich man. And really, it comes down to the fact that right here I'm running 25 gig on this thing. Do I have clients that are maxing out my 25 gig pipe? Probably not, realistically. So between the two of them, I got a 50 gig LACP pipe out there. Great. But these are obviously your hot spare, so to speak. There is some redundancy built in there. So you do want to keep these guys up and running. Now, link detected is great, but what about the rest of the stack there? If we come out here and let's do a dash S on not int ETH0, let's say. So what this is going to do for us is give us a rundown of any errors that we're seeing out here. And well, I mean, it's giving you a rundown of everything, but really errors are what we're concerned about. So if we go ahead and just grep this guy through error, be a little more readable. So receive errors, transmit errors, that's the RX and TX out there. Look for these guys, see if anything is showing non-zero at that point. You can get kind of fancy with awk out there to do a dash any, I want to say it is. But anyhow, end result is you're looking for any numbers here that are non-zero. Likewise, there's the old standby if config command. I guess it's now like IP config or IP-A, but I'm old school, so let's take a look here. In this case, this is really what I'm looking for out here. Now, the thing to keep in mind, so frame and carrier errors is what I go after initially. And when I see these out here, it's typically a case of cable or SFP. On very rare circumstances, that'll end up being a NIC. But more often than not, it's not a NIC. It's a cable or SFP. Those are the things that move around. So the thing to keep in mind, though, is one, these are only zeroed on boot. So I've been up for 168 days. These could have occurred right as I booted, as the system was coming up, and I haven't seen them since. The other thing to keep in mind is the number right above it. I've received 34 terabytes of packets, and I've kicked out 44 terabytes of packets. Of the 78.9 terabytes, let's round it up to 80, that I have shipped over there, I've dropped 16. Is that a concern? Statistically, no. Now, if I see this number increasing dramatically, if I rerun this command here, and what was 16 is now 160, and then I wait 10 seconds and run it again, and now it's 230, yeah, that's a concern at this point. Now I got something that's actively acting up. But this is not a concern. If you reach out to me and say, hey, Will, I got 16 drop packets, and I ask you how many you've transmitted, and you come back with 80 terabytes, I'm going to tell you it's not an issue at that point. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is we can also take a look at the module itself. Now, we looked at this with the hardware side. We looked at this with the networking. We're going to look at it again here because it's important to keep bringing up here. You are going to have temperatures out here if your module supports it. Let's see, we get some high thresholds at 176 degrees in the colony units here, if you will. But what you're going to want to keep an eye out for here is, let's take a look, see if we can grab it. Let's do that one. There we go. So I am currently at 145 degree freedom units. Great. I'm going to send off a threshold at 176. That's going to be my alarm. I'm going to have a warning at 158. Now, if your data center is a little on the hot side, these things can go shooting up pretty darn quick. I have heard on more than one occasion of a customer burning their fingers trying to remove a module because those things are so darn spicy. So keep in mind, just because you have some AC cooler units out there, you may also have some airflow conditions as well. So when you're looking at keeping things in tip-top shape, be sure to keep an eye on these. It's one of those really low-hanging fruit ones, but it's when they go south, they go south. So what you're going to see here is typically as this thing approaches that 158 to 176 marker out there, that 20 degrees, then what's going to end up happening here is you're going to have modules that are starting to go offline. You may see errors start surfacing. And typically it would be like, oh yeah, just swap the cable and it'll come back to life. But the reality of it is not a cable issue, it's a module issue because it's getting toasty out there. So these are all good things to keep in mind. And honestly, once your cluster's been running, and you have data flow going through it, it is good to go out here and run a lot of these commands just to get a baseline for where you expect things to be. And that way, when you do have an issue, you have something to compare it against. Because one of the worst things you can do from the support perspective is have an issue, but then have absolutely nothing to go against as whether or not that issue is normal or if it's just a one-off at that point, right? If I come out here and say, oh, my modules are 150 degrees, cool. Are they supposed to be? I don't know. Is that the norm or do you have some cooling issues? Now, this thing is sitting here at 175 degrees and that's my norm. At that point, I got problems real quick. But I would never know that if I never took a look at this to begin with. So it is something to keep in mind. Alrighty, moving along here. Let's take a look at IPMI tool and dmessage. We also looked at these during, I think it was the hardware one, but these guys are going to be good for keeping an eye out for things that we can't monitor against actively. And whoops, if you spell correctly, it works a lot better. And I'm going to show you here real quick. So this is going to go through the event list out here. And I love this cluster because it's all borked up. But we had memory errors out here. Now, mind you, this was in February. So these have since subsided. They're no longer an issue. So either swap memory or we're no longer addressing that portion of it. But it is something that was actively going on. Now, there is no way for QQ to query this, unfortunately. And likewise, I don't believe there's any way for OpenAPI to actually query this either. So this is where it's going to come down to, if you suspect something, this is going to be, add it to your admin task list. Maybe once a week do a grep for memory out there or something like that. Now we will also log these in syslog, and depending on how they interact, we may or may not open a pager event and or a ticket for it. So because they are in syslog, they will get parsed against as much as we can. Where we'll, if things are going correctly, then we'll get an alert on this and say like, oh, we've seen a high number of correctable ECCs on system Qumulo 1. Great. At that point, we'll reach out to you and we can say, hey, cool, let's take a look at this. And we'd look in syslog, see which DIM is actually having a bad day here and go about getting that thing swapped out. Great. That's if it's correctable. If it's uncorrectable, then it's a little different story. Typically, it will panic the node. Now, it doesn't mean your cluster goes down. It just means the node goes down. If you were having other issues at the same time, let's say we're back in our original situation where we had node offline. Now, this takes another node offline. Depending on your protection level, you may be able to survive that if you have a large enough cluster. But if you don't, then you'd be looking at a situation where the cluster's going to be considered offline at that point until it can reform quorum. With an uncorrectable memory error, more often than not, it will reboot the node and come back up perfectly fine. I have seen some rare occasions where it does not come back up, but those were pretty old. And I think on any of the newer releases, we're okay with that because now we're in this run anywhere stuff where we can fudge some numbers a little bit. But uncorrectable I would go out, work off the assumption that it's going to go ahead and take that node offline. So that is something to be aware of. Now, does that mean you should keep hot DIMMs on site? That's really your call. You can if you really want to. But what I have found more often than not is the larger amount of hardware that people have on site, the larger amount of hardware that goes wandering off. And I'm not saying people are taking it home or anything. Your data center folks are going to be like, oh, we need to get rid of these cardboard boxes that are in the data center. And the next thing you know, your spare DIMMs are down the trash can somewhere. So it happens. I get it. I wouldn't recommend, like I said, I wouldn't recommend fretting over it and keeping a lot of things on site. Again, if this was a memory issue that truly brings down a node and it can't come back to life, we'll get another DIMM out there. You can run with one node down. Again, there's a runway for it, but more often than not, you'll be perfectly fine out there. Alrighty. So let's take a look over at dmessage. These are going to be the kernel logs. In here, you can sometimes find things such as DIMMs going south out here as well. Take a look for drives having issues. I don't know if we can actually scroll back far enough that would have any of those. Let's see here. Capacity change. That's not terribly exciting. Probably should just grep for February, but you know what? We're almost there at this point. Oh, hey, we got some IO errors here. Cool. So back in May, this guy was having a drive that was having issues. Pardon me. Has this drive been swapped out yet? Don't know off the top of my head, but by and large, let's see how many we had here. So we had IO error on May 6th, May 6th, May 6th, May 6th. This guy really realistically should have hit the three and done failure marker. You know, it's all happened at this 14:54:59 marker. So that drive was having a really bad day from what it looks like. So that drive should have failed and moved on with his life. For the most part, I don't see a lot of admins having a need or desire to go in and look at dmessage. It's really more of one of those things that the support side would look at if needed. But by and large, the SEL list will take care of most things for you. If you're having some really crazy, weird issues, then yeah, we may need to take a look in here. But you know, it's one of those things. Now, I mean, if we scrolling back here, now we have SDN was also having some issues. Question comes down to what actually took place here. I don't know because it was what 5 months ago. But certainly, if this was all the information I had in my hands, I would say yeah, we should get rid of SDN and SDO. Whether or not those got swapped out, couldn't tell you. This is a lab cluster, so who knows what's actually going on with it. All right, moving back to slide deck land. Let's take a look at here what else we got going on. So clients are the third way that we can really get notification that something may be wrong with the Qumulo cluster. It's one of those unfortunate things where the cluster or storage in general, it doesn't have to be our cluster per se, it could be anyone's cluster. Storage in general is kind of the heart of the data center these days. So everyone's using it, and they, you know, from a client perspective, they may not realize they're using it. They think they're just going to, you know, mapping Windows server XYZ / files. Great. To them, that means nothing. To us, it means, oh, okay, we have that shared out over there. Awesome. But because it's in the heart of the data center, oftentimes, you know, we're the first go-to, if you will, when something goes awry. And that's not always the case that it is a cluster issue, but it's certainly, you know, we're happy to talk to you about it. That said, from the support side, really two things are important here. One, is it a single client? If it is, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the clients. If it's multiple clients, awesome. That's outstanding. Now we have multiple data points. Secondly, is it reproducible? If not, we can probably give you some pointers on where to go when the problem does manifest again. But by and large, if we can't reproduce it, there's not a whole lot we can do in the heat of the moment there because it's already happened. So for approaching these things, be it either from a performance perspective or a file access perspective, either way, it really comes down to these same two points to drive home of single versus many, and can I make this happen again? And if you can, absolutely, let's repro this thing. And then at that point, we can determine how we need to approach it. It may be something like kicking off diagnostics on the cluster. If it's slow access out there, it may be doing something like doing an iPerf out there. There's a couple different ways. There's many more than a couple, I guess. Many different diagnostic tools that we can look at from the cluster side. It's really just going to be dependent upon how things are manifesting. I did see out here, I just saw it now, I apologize, it's 30 minutes late. There was a question out there, who convinces HPE to replace a drive that HPE doesn't see as bad? What we will do in those situations is use our big outdoor voice. So we have an agreement with HPE that they will replace drives when we say they're bad versus when HPE says they're bad. Now, that is only an agreement with HPE. So if you have your Run Anywhere Dell box up there running, that's going to be a different story with Dell. We may need to actually go down the path of setting up larger thresholds that adhere to their threshold limit. But with our partnership with HPE, we do have it set to that 3-drive standard. And so what we will do in those cases is we will proactively open the case on your behalf. It ends up dropping us from the CC list, which is kind of the funny thing. So we can open it, but we won't have any insight to it after that fact. But then it's up to HP will reach out to you as a customer, and you guys can work through the motions of when you want to get them on site to replace it, or if they just need to send you a drive or whatever. We'll open it up, give them all your details, and then it's a case of just having to talk to them at that point. It's pretty straightforward. If for whatever reason it gets hung up, and cases where that happens is HPE may come around and say, hey, we need to see AHS logs on this. With straight drive failures, if it's single drive failure, drive failures happen, right? We typically don't need AHS logs for those. If it is a case where it's the 5th failure this week and it seems a little odd, at that point, it probably makes sense to go ahead and collect those AHS logs and work with HPE or any partner for that matter to get those fielded out there and see if there's something else more nefarious at play. What you would end up looking for is there any sort of common denominator between the failures? And this holds true with the slide that's on the screen right now as well, right? Where if I have multiple clients that are having issues, think of those as drives at this point. I have multiple drives having issues. Where does the issue lie? Is it coming down from, are they all in the same bay? Are they all running the same application if they're clients? Let's say I'm running, I don't know, Adobe something. Showing my ignorance of media entertainment right now. But let's say we're running some Adobe program, and all my clients when they run that, they're having the same issue. Outstanding. Now I can determine whether or not it's a problem with the application itself, or if there's something on the cluster that's a problem. If it's only customers who are running Adobe Photo Maker 9000 and everything else is running fine, odds are it's not a Qumulo cluster issue at that point. But that being said, we can still take a look into it and see maybe we're handling something wrong. Maybe they changed something expecting us to change it, vice versa. Going back to the land of drives out there, yeah, let's say we lose 5 drives and they're all in the same little shelf on the HPE box. Maybe I just have a bad cabling issue at that point. But, you know, going to jumping to the extreme of saying, oh, I have bad cabling or I have a bad chassis or I have bad whatever, besides just a failed drive, is a little bit on the extreme side. You know, the reality is drives fail. They do. You know, it's unfortunate, but they do. And so it's one of the most common things that we see on our side. You know, we're going through dozens of drive failures a day just because we have a large customer base at that point, you know. And now I get it as a end customer when something happens to you guys, you know, it's let's say I have a node go offline. I can give you the spiel about how nodes don't go offline that often, et cetera, et cetera. But to you as an end user, that node went offline 100% of the time. I get it. But we have to keep in mind the larger picture there, where yes, this is unfortunate that this event happened, but realistically, in the big scheme of things, is it more likely to be a drive versus a controller or vice versa? So, that being said, I think we're on the tail end here. Let's, that a mouse, that'd be great. It's somewhere here. There we go. Oh, upgrades. Let's talk about these real quick because I know we've sent out some alerts recently saying, hey, you need to upgrade. We're going to recommend the latest and greatest anytime out there. That said, I know of one customer who needs they need a release to be out there for 60 days before they'll upgrade to it. Cool. Absolutely agree with that for their workflow. Likewise, you know, that customer I was talking about early on, the hospital out there, they'll have a backup system. They'll upgrade first and then wait about 2 weeks, then go to the primary one. Cool. Absolutely. Let's make sure this is good because, again, these are life and death situations at this point. That said, why upgrade? One, spare compatibility. If you are on, let's say you install today, and I'm not sure what release de jour we have right now, but let's say it's 7.7 just for ease of use. You install with 7.7 today, you get whatever drives were available as of today that have been approved by the hardware gods to say that those work in that system. Great. If you don't touch that box for 2 years, I can almost guarantee those drives are out of any depot at that point. And if you have a drive failure, you're going to get shipped something that's not going to be seen by that system out there. So at that point, we can absolutely work around that. The problem is, to do that, we basically have to install a new image, or a new file rather, not an image, but we do have to install a compatibility list on that node. So that means take the node out of Quorum, install this, bring it back into Quorum. That's 2 Quorum events right there. Can you handle Quorum events? Good question. I don't know. So it's something to keep in mind. This has happened more often than I'd like to say, where the Qumulo system just runs, so people forget about it. They're like, oh, we don't need to upgrade it. And then finally they'll hit an issue where they actually need to upgrade it. So that is something to keep in mind. It's one of those goofy things, but when it hits you, it's no longer goofy. It's kind of important at that point. 2, service pack compatibility. This became a big one recently with, I want to say it was 7.4.4 and above, where they had the Linux kernel change. So we went from a 2004 to 2402 or something like that. Someone can correct me in the QA there for those exact numbers, but end result, there was a kernel change. As such, we talked with a lot of our vendors and they did not have the ability to test the new kernel with every firmware version out there. And so it was a broad swath that just said, you know what, upgrade to the latest SPP. We know that works. Now, SPP is great because you don't have to go through all of the incremental ones, but it does take about 45 minutes per node in my experience. Throw one of those large cluster customers on there where you have 150 nodes, you can do the math at that point. It's not a pretty picture. So it is something to keep in mind that you do want to keep it's great to keep the Qumulo software up to date, but you also have to focus on the underlying hardware if there's anything there. With a lot of the Aero and Supermicro nodes, we don't have a lot of updates that they alert us to. I know there's a couple out there in regards to like SSL bugs and issues. When those come down, they'll go ahead and issue a patch for that, but that's an underlying software patch at that point. So you'd still have to install it on the BMC, but by and large, you're not having to swap anything out. Lastly, out there is replication compatibility. Not really an issue anymore. Since 6.0, we've done it for 8 platform releases, or 8 quarterly releases, I'm sorry, which gives you 2 years of compatibility. Now, it used to be great because you could say, oh, okay, that would be, 4 to 6 is 2 years because we'd update it every year. We quit doing that because reasons. So it is a little more confusing these days, but if you read the release notes, personally, I got a big banner put up there for you guys. So it tells you exactly what release you need to be on to be compatible between things. There's nothing worse than updating one of your clusters and then all of your replications stopping. And then you have to make the command decision, okay, do we upgrade the source one or the target, whichever side, but let's say it's source because you typically upgrade the replication target first in an emergency change that we didn't want to do because we want to let it bake in here first for 2-3 weeks. And now you're kind of up, in a pickle. So with the replication compatibility being 8 quarterlies now, it works a little bit better for a lot of customers. It is something to keep in mind as you are going through these latest upgrade paths. If you have any questions on it or you're confused by the numbering scheme, by all means, please reach out. We can get those straightened out for you and you'll be in good shape. All righty. Lastly, I see we got 6 minutes left. I didn't expect to actually run this long. I thought it was going to be really short. We are out on Reddit. I drop a post out there about once a week or so. So please go join out there and comment on my cute dog pictures. No one has yet. I'm a little disappointed. And their egos are small and fragile because they're chihuahuas. So please join us out there. In about a month's time, we are going to be looking at cluster config DR. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing for this one yet. I'll be honest with you. So I'm going to be figuring that one out over the next month. But it should be exciting. If nothing else, you can see me flail in public. It'll be great. November 6th, mark calendars, and then we are going to be off until January. We typically take a winter break just because schedules don't align. You're actually getting kind of lucky to have one in November. I think we usually pause before then. So if you have any suggestions, comments, concerns, or cool recipes, please shoot them out there. Dear Grumpquat at Qumulo.com, and we will talk then. All right, folks. Well, I will let you go. Apparently, I have a meeting in 5 minutes. I should probably attend. So that being said, if you see any talking dogs this weekend, be sure to feed them tacos. All right, take care out there.